Prime Minister Mark Carney and his cabinet is preparing their first budget, expected to be tabled in October. The Prime Minister says Canadians can expect to see an austerity and investment-focused budget. And after asking cabinet ministers to find ambitious savings proposals amounting to 15% cuts or reallocation by 2028-2029, this will be the first look at the government's books since Carney became Liberal leader. And since last year's fall economic update, which projected a $42.2 billion deficit for 2025-2026, Carney has warned that this year's deficit will be larger because since then, Carney has cut income taxes, which is obviously going to be a hit to revenue. He's rolled out economic supports for groups affected by tariffs, and there's probably going to be a need for more to come. He's also pledged a massive increase in defense spending, and all of that is going to add to the deficit. And this all comes at a time when Canada's economy is facing a worsening economic picture and, of course, the ongoing trade war.
What the government is going to do, what we're in the process for the next budget, is focusing on reducing waste, reducing unnecessary federal spending, reducing the duplication in federal spending, becoming more efficient in federal spending so that we have the room, we have the force to support our businesses so they can invest for the future.
Wayne Long is the Secretary of State for the Canada Revenue Agency and Financial Institutions, and he joins me now. Wayne Long, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Great to see you, David, always.
So you've been crisscrossing the country doing pre-budget consultations with people and companies and organizations.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister says this is going to be austerity and investment in this budget. Is that what Canadians want?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I started in Kelowna, went to Calgary, Edmonton, Thunder Bay, Winnipeg, through obviously Ontario, many times to Toronto, Ottawa, then Atlantic Canada. And I think the common themes from coast to coast to coast are that people understand the ground has shifted underneath us. It's not the same world it was even 6 months ago, a year ago. And I think people are seized with the moment. I think people realize that we're at a crossroads as a country. And I mean, obviously we've had a wake-up call from the, obviously the states that are south of us, and I think people want to help. And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times across the country. Help us to help you. We want to be a part of the solution.
Okay, so that's the investment side of what you're talking about as a government. The austerity side, we don't have a lot of clarity on yet, except that the target for starting next year's budget. What are you hearing from Canadians on that? Do they want austerity in any form in this budget?
Well, I think Canadians, again, from coast to coast, understand where we are as a country. And I think that Canadians, again, from coast to coast, realize that, although we did many, many good things as a government over the last, 9 years, that it's time to kind of get our financial house in order. Again, the ground shifted underneath us. It's not the same country it was. So we need to get our fiscal house in order. I think Canadians understand that. And certainly the vibe and the feedback that we're getting in our pre-budget consultations is just exactly that. That they know there's going to be some belt tightening, know there's going to be a review. But, let's not prejudge the review. I know people are like, oh, they're going to cut and they're going to cut services and they're going to cut this and that. Let's not prejudge that. Let's go slowly. Let's internalize. I mean, obviously, each minister has been asked to tighten belts to see where there's efficiencies. And like I said before, maybe I said it in the wrong way, my very first interview actually going into cabinet with respect to corporation. But you know what? Our Prime Minister does want to run this like a business. He wants to make sure that we're accountable to Canadians. We're accountable to those who invest in us. And obviously, Canadians are the shareholders of Canada. We want to make sure that every dollar has justification, is rationalized, and is spent effectively. And I'm convinced we can hit that sweet spot.
Okay, but it's going to be a difficult job. I mean, it got overshadowed for a lot of reasons on Fall Economic Statement Day last December, the resignation of the finance minister that day in particular. $42.2 billion deficit was the projection last December. Since then, there's been an income tax cut, there's been a defense spending commitment, there's been a lot of sectoral and economic supports caused by the trade war, and there's been a worsening economy. We've seen some projections from C.D. Howe, for example, looking at a $90 billion deficit this year, right? So how do you do the things Canadians are asking you to do to give them the certainty they need to make investments when that fiscal hole is growing and enormous as it is and needs to be brought under control?
I mean, I think we were elected, I know we were elected under a mandate of fiscal responsibility, spending taxpayers' dollars wisely. ground has shifted. Like I said, it's not the same world that we were in a year ago. So we need to invest in Canada. We need to create economic growth. We need to invest in Canadians. We need to create jobs, invest in, obviously, defense, energy, different sectors from coast to coast to coast. I think we can hit that spot.
That's a deficit that goes up, not a deficit that goes down, if you have to do those things.
Well, you know what, again, I think strategic investment helps grow the economy, puts people to work, creates more tax revenue. I think there's a sweet spot that we can hit. I'm convinced that, look, it's difficult times. I think Canadians know that. Certainly during the election, I heard that door to door, that people understand the gravity of the situation. But our Prime Minister was elected for a reason. Our Prime Minister is the right Prime Minister at the right time for this country. This is a generational pivot for our country. It's a generational opportunity for our country. I honestly believe, obviously, there's no country that has a lot of risk, but there's no country that has a greater opportunity. If we invest in ourselves, if we invest in defense, if we invest in energy, we can get this right. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Right, but look, there is a massive exposure, obviously, to the uncertainty from the United States, just given the intertwined nature of the economy. And, throughout the summer, you heard from major institutional investors saying they wanted to be given a reason to invest more at home. But since the course of this year, the tariff situation has kind of gotten worse rather than getting better. The economic situation has gotten a lot worse rather than getting better.
Yep.
How do you give Canadian industry and businesses and investors comfort in such uncomfortable circumstances?
I think that obviously C5 with interprovincial trade, but also, national projects can unlock a lot of that. I think regulatory-wise, we need to look at some regulatory limitations that limited investment, that limited growth of businesses. I believe that the country and that industry is ready for us. Like I said to you earlier, I've heard time and time again, people, industry sector say to us, help us to help you. In a meeting with the Maple 8, literally there's billions.
Who's the Maple 8?
Ontario Teachers Pension Fund and, investors like that have
big
literally.
Institutional investors.
Right, billions and billions of dollars. And, a lot of that money is not invested in Canada. And, what I heard time and time again was, look, we want to invest more in Canada. Help us. Bring down regulations, spur investment, have big projects, big national projects that we can invest in. They don't hanker to invest in the States, but sometimes we have created a culture that really wasn't kind to investment. So I believe we bring down regulations, we look at some tax code, we spur investment in ourselves, and they want to be a part of the solution. I'm convinced that if we do this right, we can be the strongest economy in the G7. The Prime Minister has said that. He obviously has the experience behind him. And I believe, again, it's a generational opportunity for our country, for our government, and we will get this right.
So do you think the projects, which we understand, at least the first wave of them, will be announced later this week, probably when you're in Alberta for your caucus retreat? Yeah. If you have a list you want to share, we'll be happy to have it.
Yeah, I don't have that.
But do you think that unlocks the billions in the Maple 8? Do you think these become projects for the pension funds and the institutional investors? Will there be enough with the C5 framework and this list of projects to get that capital spent in Canada?
Yeah, I think it's a good start. I think that, again, people are looking for a reason to invest. They want to see certainty. They want to see some regulatory hurdles cleared. You talk about maybe, an energy network from coast to coast to coast. You talk about, obviously pipelines or, what have you, nuclear, what have you. I think there's all kinds of investment that the private sector is willing to do. They just need an opportunity to do it, and they need to feel welcomed.
So where does your climate plan fit into this, Wayne Long? Because we've already seen the carbon tax go. It became so toxic and polluted itself politically, it disappeared. The EV mandate is now paused and being reviewed, and we're told there's this larger climate competitiveness review happening.
Yeah.
There's a push for tanker bans to go. There's a push for emissions caps to go. There's a push for flexibility on the clean electricity regulations. At each step, it seems like Canada's climate ambitions push away because of the economic uncertainty. How do you balance it?
I mean, look, we're Liberals. The Liberal Party is obviously committed to, climate or carbon reduction. I think that's very clear. I think the Prime Minister, in his statements in his past, have been very clear with respect to carbon reduction. Again, this is not the same world we were in 6 months ago. We need to
It's the same
spur
climate we are
investment.
in. The political climate has changed. The
Sure.
actual climate
Yeah.
has gotten worse.
Absolutely, but I would stand with our climate record. I think that Minister de Brusen is doing a great job. Minister Guilbeault before her, and I think that we need to balance what's best for the climate with what's best to grow our country and grow industry and spur investment. Again, we're at a critical time for our country. It's a generational time for our country. We need billions of dollars invested in sectors from coast to coast to coast to help our economy grow, to make us resilient, to protect our sovereignty, and to grow our country. We can hit that sweet spot. I know it.
Okay.
Look, if you want to go down that hole, Pierre Poilievre says, let's cut the industrial carbon tax. Let's cut it all. We don't say that. We believe in the industrial carbon tax.
No, I get that. But for a decade, we heard the climate and the economy can work together. If you don't have a plan for one, you don't have a plan for the other. And now consumer carbon tax is gone,
Right.
the EV mandate is paused, and everything else is up for review, right? So now the argument seems to be it's difficult for them to work together when trade is being disrupted, and climate may be the thing that gets chucked overboard.
Yeah, I understand that. But again, it's a different world. We need to spur investment. We need to spur our economy. We will do that with nation-building projects. I'm convinced we can get it right.
What about the size of the civil service, just as a final point?
Sure.
The public sector unions are deeply alarmed by what they hear about with the 15% reallocation targets, starting in next year's budget. Already, we're seeing a lot of young people being told their contracts aren't being renewed and different things like this. I mean, where does the civil service go? Where does the size of government go under this?
I think it needs to be reviewed. I think I wouldn't prejudge. Again, I've said to people, UTE, PSAC, don't prejudge the process. We want to look at everything. We want to look at, obviously, the public service. We want to look at middle management, upper management. We want to look at every line item. I obviously come from a small business background, and, a lot more zeros, obviously, in the federal government budget. But, it's incumbent on us as elected officials to look at every line item on that expense side and say, okay, where can we get efficiencies? Where can we get rid of duplication? Where can we make things more nimble for Canadians? I, again, believe we're going to get it right.
Okay, a lot of pressure and a lot of balancing. Wayne Long, Secretary of State for the Canada Revenue Agency and Financial Institutions. Good to see you, sir.
Always good to see you, David.
Okay, we're going to start there with the power panel. Vandana Cotter was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Kate Harrison is a conservative political analyst. And here with me in the flesh in the studio is Brad Levine. He's a former national campaign director for the NDP. And Rob Russo is the Canada correspondent for The Economist. It is good to see you all. We're talking economics, so I'm going to start with the guy from The Economist. Wayne Long talks about finding that sweet spot. What's the sweet spot between investment and austerity when you're in the middle of the trade war and people are looking for help?
You didn't introduce me this time as a former CBC bureau chief, and reminding people that I used to ask you and others to do stories. One of the things that I used to ask people to do was to come up with a narrative arc, particularly on a complicated story. What is the necklace that we're trying to put pearls on, right?
Right.
I don't know what it is yet with this budget. Is it austerity or is it investment? I'm not sure if the Prime Minister wants a deal with the United States or is turning us away from the United States because things are never going to be the same as they ever were before. I think the government, and I think Mr. Long was starting to get at this, the government needs to tell us that we're going to go through a very, very difficult time, an arduous journey. It's going to be tough in some instances. I think he's beginning to signal that, laying the foundation for that toughness by bringing in the equivalent of an economic statement when it comes to help for industries that are going to be affected during this difficult time. He needs to tell us that and then tell us how he's going to get us to the promised land that he talked about, where we can give ourselves more than anybody can take away. But that I've yet to see that narrative arc.
Yeah, I guess, Vandana, on the narrative arc, I'll break it into a symphony, 3 acts. Friday's announcement was like the scaffolding around the economy to kind of help support it. The budget will be their fiscal plan, and the projects will be the path forward for growth. But how do you do all of that when you're looking at maybe a deficit of $90 billion, V, and deliver the support you need and not absolutely blow the finances of a federal government?
Yeah, I think for the most part, Prime Minister Carney has spent the whole summer making different announcements that are big ticket items. So defense spending, supports for industry, supports for workers affected by industries that are affected by tariffs. So I think those, in terms of big ticket spending items, I don't think there's going to be many surprises in the budget. I think what they mean by austerity, and I'll touch on Rob's point on the story arc in a moment, but when it comes to austerity, I think what they're looking at is where to streamline government. And something I've heard the Prime Minister talk about on the campaign, talking about making government work faster, being more nimble. So I think what you'll see is like grandfathering of some programs that may not be of use to Canadians anymore. I think also like having gone through the budget process, people come to you a lot with like special projects that I think there won't be a lot of leeway for anymore. So I think things like that will be where you'll find more of the austerity, because those things, as much as they are small things in a bigger picture, they do add up over time. And right now, every dollar counts. So I think you'll see a lot of focus on investment, as Prime Minister Carney has talked about, but not a lot of fun spending or things that people are used to, like special projects and their ridings here and there.
But, you know, Kate, it's interesting to see sort of the messaging change a little bit. You know, as Rob was talking about, he's started to use the word rupture, the Prime Minister has, and what's happening with the United States, and really, you know, doubling down on the fact that 85% of our goods are still able to go in tariff-free, which is, you know, obviously down 15% from where things started with NAFTA. I mean, what does that signal to you about where this is going? Because the conditions have gotten pretty bad, and they look like they're going to get worse before the turnaround could even begin to happen.
I'm not sure there's a more iconic duo than a Liberal government promising or saying or messaging that they are going to deliver austerity and belt tightening, and then delivering a budget that is anything but. And when I look at Friday's most recent announcement, billions of dollars in new spending, and a lot of that probably needed to help a lot of these tariff-impacted industries. But if the government is going to keep spending billions of dollars for steel and aluminum and helping workers transition to new employment, then at the very least, I think Canadians are owed an update on where the status of conversations sit when it comes to eliminating the tariffs that are the rationale for all of this spending. In 2023, Chrystia Freeland talked about the need for belt tightening, and all we saw was government spending increase. So if the Prime Minister and the government are sincere and authentic about the message that things need to change, the floor is what we had today in terms of finding cuts and efficiencies within the government. I think a lot of Canadians would expect that. But what's missing is, what does that mean for me? And that was also missing in the Friday announcement. I think the big thing that's really absent from a lot of the conversations happening right now is key measures to address affordability across the board. And that involves the very uncomfortable thing, looking at, you know, legislation that might need to change in order to encourage more investment here, or cuts to some places in order to help offset or provide affordability measures elsewhere. But a lot of this is very much geared towards subsidy for corporations, not a lot for people. And at least from my perspective, the government's doing a very poor job in messaging what those billions and billions of dollars to help course correct the economy are going to mean for everyday affordability. And that's where the politics of this really lie.
So Brad, this is something the NDP have been on, you know, certainly going back a while about, you know, workers were not necessarily at the focus of the tariff response. We did see things on reskilling, you know, longer benefits for long tenured employees who might lose their jobs, waiving waiting periods. A lot of the new money was credit facilities for companies so they could borrow because they can't get money from the banks or struggle to get money from the banks. But how do you continue to put the floor under the economy while also putting a floor under the deficit number and the debt number post-COVID now going into this disruption?
Well, I think that's the great contradiction, right? This notion that we can say with a straight face that Mr. Long is talking about and other members of cabinet saying, we're going to bring in austerity and we're going to bring in new investments. Those are contradictory. What they're really saying is we're going to cut some areas that are not our priorities and we're going to backfill certain areas that are our priorities. And Friday's announcement was where those priorities are. They're going to have to cut a tremendous amount of money in this October budget. In addition to him, Carney, talking about belt tightening, 7% expenditure growth, twice as much as GDP growth. Let's not forget that he's also committed to spending tens of billions of dollars on defense in the immediate term. So that's going to have to be in the budget as well. So then the ultimate question over the coming weeks between now, House coming back on Monday, and of course the budget being tabled, is Canadians wondering what programs are going to get cut. Now, he said in the past, well, we're not going to cut transfers to individuals. I can't see how he can keep all of these commitments whole and fulfill all of those commitments to all those Canadians, because there's just not the money to be had. You look at efficiencies. You can cut some of the Trudeau programs. I think a lot of there were some programs, I think, that were off the side of the desk, maybe on the back of a napkin. That's not going to create the billions and billions of dollars that he needs to, A, cut overall government spending, and B, make room for the defense spending, and 3, the Friday announcements about the tariff expenditures. I just can't see it can be done.
Right. So Rob, to bring you back to the narrative element, like the defense spending becomes about a defense industrial policy that creates jobs, drives economic activity, leads to growth, and will lead
a lot
to
of dual-use spending.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the argument has to become that it will pay for itself in a way, and bring revenue back. But boy, that's something that takes a long time. And that's even, if you move fast, and you have to bundle whatever you do on the austerity side with some hope, because that's the only way the public sort of buys into it, right?
Yeah, I found it interesting to listen to Wayne Long almost throttle back a little bit on the notion of austerity. There's been quite a reaction to that word that was only used in French since the Prime Minister used it on Friday.
But he accepted it. You know what I mean? The Prime Minister said, yes, it's going to be a blend, right?
There was a Léger poll out in Quebec today that showed that it has negative connotations, this notion of austerity. And watching Mr. Long say, well, wait a second, it might not be as severe as you say. When we talk about a 15% cut, what are we talking about? If you average out over 3 years, it's 5% a year. In many instances, that's attrition when you're talking about a big government. However, as Brad points out, some departments are not going to be hit very hard. Defense is not going to be hit very hard. They're spending more money. If we're talking about transfers to provinces, I don't anticipate that health is going to be hit particularly.
Well, transfers to provinces and individuals are sacrosanct, is what he says, the Prime Minister.
So that means some departments are going to be hit much, much harder than others. There's another important distinction, I think, between this notion of austerity, if we're going to use that word, comparing it to the last time. I don't think anybody was born here, that something like this happened in 1995-96.
I was there.
You're a young man, Brad.
Brad was leading the Canadian Federation of Students in protesting the tuition increases that Paul Martin inflicted on us all.
Brutal budget.
An important distinction between now and then is that the Canadian economy was about to go into a period of gushing expansion, fueled by the United States. That's not happening now. Our GDP is falling. Our unemployment is going up. We're in a trade war with our biggest trade partner. We're in a trade war with our second biggest trading partner. Is this really the time to be talking about austerity if those are the conditions surrounding your decision?
Yes, and the bond raters were beating on the door in 1995 too, which is slightly different than today. So V, given all of that, I mean, what does austerity look like? Because you can already see sort of a scaling back of some things where they're worried about inflicting extra damage, right? Like carbon tax went out the door for political reasons and other things. The EV mandate is now on pause. So like climate policy is starting to be shoved to the back burner to avoid economic costs, industrial costs, and further potential disruption at a time of great uncertainty.
I think it depends on how Canadians take it. And I think to Kate's point, it's what's in it for me. So I think if austerity measures like connected Canadians, so I don't see a world where they're cutting the CCB or childcare, which are things that will directly affect Canadians. I think if it's not that, austerity just can mean if it's public service, if it's programming from the government, I think Canadians can understand that. I think where Canadians don't get deficits or they feel upset by deficits if they don't know what it's for. You mentioned, the defense spending. These are generational investments. We have a big issue with our largest trading partner. We have to find new markets. We have to spur industry. It's not a time for austerity in that way. So I think as long as it doesn't affect Canadians directly or they don't feel the impact of that austerity, I think they can be comfortable and they can understand that what is the deficit going towards? Is it more investments? And if investments to prevent us from going into a recession, to protect Canadian jobs overall, I think in the macro scheme of things, Canadians can fully understand that.
Okay, I want to just get a quick round here on climate, because the Industry Minister, Melanie Joly, was asked today about the 2030 targets, and she kind of wouldn't be emphatic that they're going to commit to it. Environment Minister Julie de Bruzen put out a statement today saying Canada is committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Taking into account the evolving global and economic context, the federal government will provide an update on its emissions reduction plan as we strive towards our 2030 and 2035 targets. Kate, what do you take from that? It's not we're on track and committed and we will, it's we strive and we're going to adjust.
The government has exercised an acrobatic level of change in terms of its climate policy. Talk about the carbon tax, the EV mandate. It's pretty clear that these are walkbacks. Although I would note with the EV mandate, of course, it seems to me that the Prime Minister is trying to balance either his own personal views on climate policy and environmental policy and green financing, or that of at least a significant member of his cabinet and caucus, because if you were listening purely to industry, if you were listening to the automakers, for example, it would be clear that this is off the agenda to be revisited at a much later time, not just a 60-day review. So I do observe a fair bit of tension between, what the government is saying and doing on that today, and probably where their hearts and minds lie on these environmental policies. I think the really uncomfortable stuff, David, that the government is going to have to look at on environmental policy will involve looking at C-48, the tanker ban, and C-69, the environmental impact bill. And there was some discussion about looking at all of these things. The government hasn't taken that step. So you can see this real tension at the fore here. And, just to reference back to the earlier conversation, government operations and efficiencies, one way to get money. The other way to do it is, of course, by spurring investment. If the government wants to help, broaden the tax base and that way bring more people here, create more jobs, and therefore collect more income tax, then they can do that by eliminating some of these really painful pieces of legislation that industry is telling the government are barriers to investment and growth.
Brad, the new phrase that has entered the Liberal lexicon is climate competitiveness, and they're going to have a strategy around that coming out in the next couple of weeks. It sounds like, to me, everything could potentially be on the table. The emissions cap, the whole works. I mean, how do you view it?
You have 2 quarters of economic shrinkage. We could be in a recession within the next quarter. We've got precarious employment. We've got high youth unemployment. We've got a lot of economic uncertainty. When Canadians feel that, the issue of the environment and action on climate change goes way down on the priority list. You can see some of the things already moving up. Obviously, cost of living, affordability, and things like immigration have moved up from traditionally lower levels to much higher front of mind issues. The environment is going to be, as long as the economy is suffering, Canadians will not put the environment as high of a priority list. Giving, I think, for Liberals, it gives us tremendous clearance for them to abandon some of their commitments. They can keep moving, as previous governments have always done. They just keep moving the targets later and later. So I see that this is in keeping with, I think, long-standing, when Liberals, when it comes down to making tough decisions, and we've laughed around this table in the past. They used to, they fought like hell for the carbon tax, and then all of a sudden, when Carney said no carbon tax, even the former Minister of the Environment said we're getting rid of the carbon tax. It didn't work. So, for the environment, for the Liberals, the environment and environmental policies can be easily kicked down the road. Okay,
quick from Rob and then Vandana, and then I got to take a break.
It reminds me of every time I hear Pierre Poilievre complaining about Mark Carney taking his policies, it reminds me of the Soviet judge giving the Canadian skater a 9.9 unexpectedly. He's in essence saying, why are you worried about voting for me? This guy's given us what we want anyway. And it explains why there are a lot of Conservatives who seem to prefer Mark Carney as PM. Anybody who knows Mark Carney knows he's serious about the environment. You got to deal with the alligator that's closest to you. There's an alligator snapping its jaws right now at Canadians, and it's the economic demon is snapping its jaws at us.
Yeah, but Vandana, there's also been a summer of wildfires everywhere. You know what I mean? And 38-degree weeks throughout Atlantic Canada when I was on vacation out there. I mean, just your thoughts on where this all goes, because it sounds like they're setting people up for a shift.
I think this shift is actually different from what people are talking about now. I think under Trudeau, our goal was to use policy to influence consumer behavior. I think under Prime Minister Carney, it's the reverse. Where do consumers need to leave to us to make changes to the environment? Because the most important thing, and Prime Minister Carney knows this, is buy-in. people have to buy into it and it has to be accessible to them. So EV mandates, for example, I would love to have an EV. If I find it expensive and too much for my household, I don't know how many Canadians can get an EV. I do a lot of rural driving. There's not a lot of places to charge an EV car. So that kind of cuts out a lot of the segment of the population. So what can make it more friendly? So I think where Mark Carney will change things is more consumer-led environmental policy rather than try to get Canadians on board with a policy that they may not be ready for yet, or even we don't have the infrastructure to support us yet.